Other way.
Did you check that? You can hear it. Okay.
And if you use that, it'll be fine.
Okay. And I should close one of those.
Close the back.
You can close one of them, I guess.
Hmm?
It's on camera.
Huh?
Not on camera.
It's good.
Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Ralph. I teach here at NYU in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to a meeting of the Race and Public Space Working Group. The Race and Public Space Working Group, sponsored by the Institute of Public Knowledge, is designed to facilitate graduate student research and to give faculty members opportunities to collaborate and work on the research in tandem. I also want to announce an event we have tomorrow. We're holding a Black History Month transcribathon. In honor of Black History Month, we have a 12-hour transcribathon that goes from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. tomorrow. We're helping the Boston Library to transcribe an archive they have of handwritten correspondence between 19th century anti-slavery activists, so that it can be more easily researched and read by the broader public and by researchers. That transcribathon will be held here in this building, 20 Cooper Square. We're meeting on the 4th floor conference room at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, and it will continue in different locations in the building until 9 p.m. tomorrow morning. So feel free to be in contact for more information about that. This spring, we launched the Reparations Project as a way to bring coherence to the interdisciplinary research orientation that we maintain at the Race and Public Space Working Group. It's a way to kind of foreground our dedication to public knowledge as the institute who sponsors us, encourages us to do. The Reparations Project series features scholars, activists, lawyers, artists, medical doctors, academics in conversation about a range of issues, from the prospect of reparations for colonial slavery in Haiti to reparations for Jim Crow to different forms of theft in Jamaica involving European tourists that are framed as reparations, to a conversation about the 2008 bailout and whether or not reparations are due to American taxpayers. Today I'll be discussing some of my own research on the relationship between slavery and the U.S. life insurance industry. Often when we talk about slavery and insurance, we think about slaves as cargo, like slaves being insured before passage at sea. And in fact, one of the most memorable incidents involving slaves as cargo and insurance involves the 18th century British slave ship called the Zong. At some point in the Zong's passage, as we discussed during our first reparations event this semester briefly, the ship captain realized that he didn't have enough water for his cargo and the crew and decided to throw 132 enslaved people overboard to collect the insurance money. So this became a sort of lightning rod for the abolitionist project. Even the famed 18th century intellectual and activist Alano Equiano wrote about it and the horrors of the Zong. That lended a lot of momentum to the abolitionist crusade. And so that, arguably, the Zong case helped foster momentum for abolition of the slave trade, which in the U.S. occurred in 1808. And so in many ways, today's research is about what happened after 1808. So between 1808 and the time that slavery was outlawed in the U.S., people could no longer technically bring slaves into the country legally because the slave trade had been banned. So people could either smuggle slaves in, which relied on serendipity. They could breed slaves, which they did, especially in places like Virginia in large numbers, but that required careful attention to the human life cycle. Or people who had slaves in abundance could just rent them to various industries or to other people who wanted slaves, especially to people who were moving west or moving to newly acquired territories of the U.S. And so, as people rented slaves to businesses or to other people, they began to insure them because they wanted to be able to recover most of the value of this highly esteemed property if a slave died while in someone else's possession. So, as a result, and particularly because slaves were rented out to Americans' most lucrative industries, there emerged this huge industry in slave insurance. And it's worth noting that even Americans weren't really that fond of life insurance at the time. There still were a lot of ideas about the human body being too sacred to put a price on, and even life insurance was still working to become a permanent part of the kind of financial and social landscape in the U.S. And so, one way to think about slave insurance is that, in fact, it was the practice of insuring enslaved people who had premium skill sets, who worked in industries that were seen as very lucrative, very dangerous, that helped to establish the kind of familiarity with insurance that would even help the U.S. life insurance industry to boom amongst free citizens. And by the 1840s in the U.S., the number of enslaved people who were insured in the Upper South approximates the number of free citizens holding life insurance policies on their own lives in the northeastern cities. So that just goes to show how quickly life insurance became a major part of the landscape in the U.S. Today, I'll be discussing in particular a project I've developed called the Treasury of Weary Souls, which is essentially like a slave insurance treasury database. And this project is based on probably about 7 years of research. And in many ways, this research is influenced by the reparations movement in the U.S. The first major collections of data and historical records about slave insurance come about as a result of legislation that was passed in California in 2000 and then in Illinois in 2004 by elected officials. And the legislation states any financial institution that wants to operate in these states has to disclose its historic relationship to the slave trade. As a result, companies came forth, most notably, as you'll see in this Treasury, Aetna, AIG, and New York Life Insurance, indicating that they had acquired policies either from companies that had previously held them, or that they had acquired policies when these same companies existed in the earlier iteration that involved insuring enslaved people. And so they would just have their general counsel send letters to the state insurance archives indicating the policy numbers and the owner and information like the name of the enslaved person and often what kind of occupation that person performed, where that person worked. And those were the sort of first sorts of data for slave insurance. After that, so I began with those archives and then sort of looked in other kinds of collections, smaller collections, and over the course of the past 7 years, began to do a lot of collection of data and analysis of data on the kinds of occupations for which people were insured, where they were insured, who the owners were, who the enslaved people were, etc. Then at some point, it occurred to me that obviously this could be an important resource for scholars, and but it didn't yet cohere as, say, a book with a clear argument or a clear story. So I thought of it more as an archive or a multimedia archive. And so I consulted with a number of different coders and programmers and people who are experts in data visualization. And I received the most impressive proposal from a firm in Boston called Resilient Coders. And Resilient Coders' mission also appealed to me because it's about helping young people of color who have not had the same kinds of educational or employment opportunities as others, and trains them for jobs in the tech sector. So together working with Resilient Coders for the past year or so, we developed what's now the Treasury of Weary Souls. So I'll say a little bit about the Treasury, and then I would love to hear questions and sort of follow up on whatever might be unclear. Um, so as you can see, the Treasury consists primarily of a map that can be viewed either in terms of uh, the insurer. So you can see AIG, Aetna, New York Life Insurance. These are companies that are still in existence, and it indicates the number of policies. Altogether, there are 1,300 policies.
It's really hard to make anything.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Sure. Thank you. You can turn all the light switches off. If you want.
That's much better.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, now we can read that.
Thank you. So, as you can see, AIG and then New York Life Insurance are companies still in existence. An earlier iteration of AIG was US Life. New York Life Insurance was once known as Nautilus. And then you see here that a large number of policies were held by the Baltimore Life Insurance Company. And the Baltimore Life Insurance Company is a firm that at one point had essentially trafficked in more slave insurance policies than any other insurance company. And it's defunct, it doesn't exist anymore, but it preserved something of an archive with its records, and so we're still able to access them. And most insurance companies actually weren't interested in slave insurance policies, especially in the first few decades, because they weren't quite sure how to price an enslaved person in the way they thought of as accurate, right? Because free citizens' lives were priced using life tables instead of early rudimentary actuarial notions. But since enslaved people were legally property, they were not viewed in the same way. And so the estimate of what they are valued at was much more subjective. And so a lot of insurance firms worried that they couldn't price enslaved people consistently and sort of avoided the industry altogether. They also probably didn't suspect that it would necessarily be that lucrative, and they were perhaps even concerned about what economists tend to call moral hazard, that like if you insure slaves, what if people just sort of kill their slave people to collect on the policies, the amount of the policy, and then it sort of defeats the purpose. What we discover instead is that during the last few decades of legalized slavery, it's as if there emerged two different tiers of enslaved people, and far from sort of brutalizing or killing enslaved people to collect the insurance, it's as if people only tended to insure slaves that were likely to generate a lot of revenue, and also granted those enslaved people more mobility than other kinds of slaves. So if you look at the records, you notice that of 1,300 records, not one of them has to do with sort of like a plantation slave, for instance, picking cotton, or just a enslaved person cutting sugarcane. Instead, there are several different sort of forms of employment that are understood to be much more highly skilled. So I'll say a bit about that and show some data on that. So the kinds of occupations for which people were typically insured tended to be, as you can see, servants and cooks. And this is based on an earlier graph when I had only at that time discovered 1,086 policies, but mostly it's still essentially consistent with the data I have now. So you see servants and cooks, artisans, steamboat workers, coal miners, other kinds of laborers, agriculturalists, factory workers, railroad workers, and mill and distilling workers. And at that time, a large number of the enslaved people occupations were unknown, and I've since sort of essentially figured out what most of those unknown occupations are. And if you see the breakdown, a servant or cook could be a house servant, it could be a nurse or a washer. Artisan could be a baker, a butcher, a barber, a brickmaker, carpenter. My favorite entry is there's one of the 1,300 for a cigar maker. And then steamboat workers also, in some sense, that term is misleading because, in fact, it will refer to firemen, engineers, people who sort of focused on the engine within a steamboat to make sure it didn't explode. If you've read Walter Johnson's River of Dark Dreams, you'll note that he has a discussion about steamboats and how volatile they were, that people saw these spectacular explosions every so often of steamboats who literally just went up in smoke. Or it could be a cook or waiter on board steamboats serving people. Then you have coal miners, agriculturalists, and then enslaved people who worked in various mills and distilleries. So as you notice, the kinds of enslaved people who are insured tend to be the people who work in households and who work in households managing them or worked in households for decades, or it's people who worked in some kind of industrial capacity and tended not to be what is our some most familiar notion of an enslaved person, someone working on a plantation, doing sort of backbreaking labor all day. And obviously, this suggests that the notion of what counts as skill is both narrow and subjective. Because obviously it does require tremendous skill and dexterity to pick cotton or to cut sugar cane. So it's not as if it is obvious that those forms of labor are less skilled. But it's interesting to note that this is how the marketplace values certain kinds of skills over others, and recognize certain kinds of skills as both more scarce and also um, more highly esteemed. So one way of looking at the chart allows you to do it through the insurer, and then there's a kind of mouse over it where you can just look at one of the small dots and see here's an enslaved person named Lucy who worked in Spotsylvania, Virginia. The occupation is not listed. The owner is George Roten. Um, you have Stephen Edwards, enslaved person who worked in Petersburg, Virginia. Let's see okay, here you have Andrew from Richmond, Virginia, owned by Thomas Doswell, tobacco factory worker, insured by the Baltimore Life Insurance Company. So the mouse over sort of allows you to identify within this sort of data set a particular reference, and then also to find out some information, the name of the enslaved person, the owner, the insurance company, and then often, usually the occupation as well. I had an exchange this morning with a curator at the New York University Library, and he said, well, I have many questions about this. One, first of all, who was that slave in Arkansas? And then he also asked about, sorry, I'll tell you about that. Then he also asked about West Virginia, why it looked like there weren't enslaved people in West Virginia. And I was sort of pointing about the West Virginia that I suspect that there probably could arguably be that, at the time, West Virginia, for much of the antebellum period, didn't exist, right? It was sort of, Virginia was just all together, and then West Virginia created later. So in a way, it's understood to be Virginia, not West Virginia. So that sort of explains that. The enslaved person in Arkansas is a servant, which just goes to show you that in any given context, when someone saw an enslaved person, that person thought of that skill set as rare, and that person is valuable, that person was insured. And there were places where the industry was concentrated, but there were also places in which someone decided to do it, even if it wasn't prevalent in the region. It also goes to show that many insurance companies would sort of take a policy on an enslaved person, even if, in general, they didn't think of enslaved people as being particularly lucrative as an industry. There's a way in which, before they thought not to bother with it, they were already doing it in some kind of ad hoc and sort of provisional way. Okay, the other way to look at this is through the industry rather than through the insurer, and so you see like domestic workers account for essentially almost 50% of the policies. Um, Miners account for about 15% of the policies, and also people working in hemp in Kentucky account for about 15% of the policies. And elsewhere, I'm writing a lot about slavery and incarceration in Kentucky, and as it relates to the hemp industry. And it's just interesting to know like which particular industries thought of the kind of work enslaved people were doing as highly skilled and highly valuable. Obviously, there's other kinds of work, as I mentioned, artisanal work, bricklayer, etc., baker. Okay, so that I think is an overview of the site, how it works, and what's at stake in the project. And I guess the last thing I'll say is a little bit about the title. For a long time, I was working with the title Slave Church Treasury. I would describe it as a Slave Church Treasury, obviously because it is a kind of ledger of enslaved people. Treasury because I wanted to foreground the capital or the economic value involved. But that just felt kind of sterile and kind of overly financial or something. I thought there's much more to this. And as I thought about it, I was like, these people in the database, they're people's ancestors. They're people who lived, it's people whose lives mattered. So I thought, okay, they were souls, they have souls. So Treasury Weary Souls. Weariness because I thought weariness captured the idea of being fatigued, exhausted, spent, having toiled. Weariness has all those kinds of associations. So it seemed appropriate to entitle that Treasury Weary Souls. So I guess with that, I'll open up to questions, and then I'm happy to follow up on any aspect of the site. And I would encourage you to take a look at the site on your smartphones or laptops or whenever you have time. Thank you. So, yes, and
So I was really struck. These early insurers had trouble valuing the slaves. Because I thought, I guess that it would be easier to do that kind of valuation than it would be to value the worth of real people, right? People who are perceived as having some intrinsic moral worth or souls or whatever. Slaves could maybe be likened to just machines, and maybe you could just make calculations of, how many logs they could cut, how many bottles they could help distill, or maybe even in the case of servants, what it would have cost to pay a white person to do that kind of labor. So I guess I'm curious, what is it exactly that these early insurers thought was tricky and subjective about valuing slaves?
That's a great question. The question, I'll just repeat it because we're live streaming. The question is, what was so tricky about insuring slaves? Because it's possible to calculate how productive an enslaved person could be, and can you just value it like you would value or price any kind of property or something like that? So I think, yes, in the sense, slaves legally being property, you can insure them like you do other kinds of property. But I would say that as property, most people didn't necessarily think it was that important to insure slaves because it could be better financially to just work them to death and then replace them. Like, why bother with an insurance policy if essentially they have depreciating value, right? So whenever enslaved people were likened to like livestock or any other kind of agricultural implement, usually someone's making an argument about why it doesn't make sense to insure them. So like Josiah Knott, the famed 19th century scientist, and he also worked in the insurance industry, would say, if an enslaved person is producing wealth for you, it's great. But if they're sort of over the hill, it's no different than a superannuated horse. And he's like, it doesn't make sense to insure them. And so in the framework of thinking of enslaved people as cargo or as livestock, most people didn't seem to think of it as financially beneficial to insure them. In terms of free citizens, the idea with a free citizen is that this person is living, you're trying to project or anticipate this person's death, so there's kind of rudimentary life tables that are doing that work. Then at some point there will also be actuarial projections about how much that person is likely to earn over the course of a lifetime, and that's figured into the calculus for life insurance. And so I think there was a lot of reticence around life insurance for free citizens as well, but people were skeptical just because it didn't seem like slaves would necessarily produce that much value to make it worth the trouble of a policy or something like that. It was only when an enslaved person was working in an industry and had acquired skills that seemed like they would accrue value over time, I think. Because the interesting thing about insured slaves is that they're people whose value goes up over time. And even into the ages that we would think of as maybe old age for an enslaved person, like 40, you see like policies with very high premiums for like a coal mining slave that's 40 years old or something like that. So I think that's probably what's interesting about enslaved people as property is that it's the only form of property that accrues value rather than depreciates over time, right? And particularly accruing value based on skill set. So I think it was grappling with this idea of expertise or skill. If an enslaved person was seen as livestock, it was seen as not troublesome. And in fact, to your point, people would say, well, yes, you could insure a slave, but that would be like insuring a horse or insuring a mule. People would actually have conversations like that. So in that vicinity, it seemed like it would be that productive. Like it was valuable, but not with the policy of not with the hassle of a policy and a premium or something like that.
So a related question about the kind of profitability of this industry. So like, I wonder if part of their struggle, you kind of hinted at this before, about the moral hazard problem. Part of their difficulty in assigning the value was to try to avoid that issue. And just, I'm curious, like, did the insurance companies were they making money off of these policies? How often were people cashing in on these?
That's a good question. So yeah, I think that I'm sure that there was some effort to avoid just the moral hazard question, and I guess it's worth sort of reiterating that slave insurance becomes big sort of between 1808 and 1865, particularly in the 1830s and 40s, and by then already you have the slave trade in Britain was abolished in 1808 and into the U.S. in 1808. 1807, I guess in Britain, British Empire, and then 1808 in the U.S. And then even by 1833, you have slavery abolished in the British Empire altogether, right? And the abolitionist movement has gained a lot of momentum in the U.S. by that point. So it's a fraud proposition to insure enslaved people because it obviously is reminiscent of, this is a reminder of the financial monetary value attached to them, right? So I'm sure there was something there about that. Yeah, it was definitely profitable. And when people are making arguments about why they would want to do it, so what's interesting is a lot of companies would say they were going to take policies on slaves, and yet individual agents would still write policies on slaves or persuade the company to take policies on slaves by saying, I know we don't generally do policies on slaves, but in this case, I can show you this person who generates this amount for this company, and so they make sort of individual ad hoc policies and things like that. The question that so it's profitable, the question of just how, and I think proof of how profitable it was is partly about just how central it seemed to be to the way industry worked in certain places. Like the fact that the overwhelming majority of the Baltimore life insurance companies' policies were coal miners in Virginia, and the fact that so many people using coal mines thought to use slave insurance policies proves that they thought it was beneficial. I think the trickier question to answer, the question that I'm not actually able to answer is just how profitable is it? So from my calculations, this site has about like 15% of the policies that these companies would have sold based on the way the policies are numbered, like you see like, number X to X, and then like a huge gap in the number X to X. So like presumably they number continuously, and this we don't know what those policies are. So based on just my calculations, there are at least sort of 85% of these policies missing, and then also potentially policies from other companies missing. So it's hard to get a sense of the scope of the industry and just how vastly slave insurance policies were used, except that it seems that it was used quite a bit in certain places for certain specific industries, And also, I guess the range of industries for which it was used says something about how important it was for those industries. Thank you.
This is a two-part question, but if you have more highly skilled laborers that you're insuring, I'm wondering if part of the calculation for the value might be that the more highly skilled workers are more likely to be farmed out to other people for, I know there was a practice of a lot of enslaved people leaving the plantation or wherever they were based and going to work for others, and then the owner getting a share of their earnings. Usually the bulk of their earnings went to the owner. So I wonder if that factored into the greater value or the greater desire to insure them. And then the second part of that question is, and I have no idea, would those more highly skilled workers who were able to travel and leave locations be more likely to escape? And if the insurers would pay for them if they were just escaped slaves, or did they have to die or become disabled?
Thank you for your question. So the first question is about what it means to kind of farm out slaves and the practice of slaves. And I'm not sure exactly what you mean by farmed out, but I guess you mean rented out to people?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think renting slaves or hiring slaves, depending how you think of it, is essential to the practice of insurance because it's precisely because this enslaved person that's incredibly valuable and also potentially working in a very dangerous industry like coal mining or railroads or steamboats. That's the reason to take out a policy. So it sort of goes hand in hand with like slave insurance is most prevalent in urban areas that have a lot of industry in them where people are engaged in the practice of renting out slaves. And obviously the reason to rent them rather than sell them is because now slaves are more scarce. And so, you can't just buy and sell them in the same way you could when the supply seems almost limitless. And so, yes, that's essential to it. And related to that, yes, it's the question of escape. And that also raises a few other questions. So, I said before that enslaved people who were insured often exhibited more mobility than plantation slaves, people who are sort of picking cotton or cutting sugar cane. And I think the reason for that is this sense that they want these enslaved people to be really productive, right? And I think this also is linked to this idea that people working on plantations are more equated with livestock at times, and people with skills are more equated with workers who you want the most output from, right? So I think part of the story is really that in the insured and enslaved person is the origin of the U.S. working class, really, because partly what's going to happen is that we use incentives to motivate enslaved people who are insured and skilled, like at times even cash incentives, at times allow them to negotiate better terms of employment, at times allow them to negotiate proximity to family and loved ones, which they're not necessarily going to do for plantation slaves. And it's not to say that slavery was comfortable for them, because many of these people who are insured with certain premium skill sets might have begun life as plantation slaves under a very coercive regime and might or could potentially be demoted back to that regime, so they're part of that world as well. But they could be, in the context of the skills they're acquiring more mobility and more control over their work schedule, and given more incentives to unleash higher output. And so, in terms of escape, it's hard to say how often insurance companies pay out, because I only have data on a few different payouts. I don't actually have a lot of data on payouts, but so that's a good question. And I think part of the reason to help enslaved people who are highly skilled negotiate flexibility around the work regime is the fear of mobility, that they are more mobile. And so what you notice in other places, like say Maryland, where there were both like enslaved people who understood to be highly skilled and literate, and they're also in proximity to free African American populations. You see this looming threat of escape, or the fear of escape, by people who own enslaved people. And so what they then are enticed to negotiate better conditions to prevent people from escaping, like sort of like deter people from escaping, even negotiating sort of like end dates to their time of enslavement, saying like, like, okay, you've been enslaved 10 more years and you'll have earned your freedom. That happened a lot in Maryland, particularly because of the fear that these people had some skills that could essentially liberate themselves, But I guess this question of incentives and mobility is also, I guess, brings up another thing that I said before, which is that, when you think about the conversation that's happening, the very important conversation happening around slavery and capitalism in both historical research and in the sort of popular, like film or something like that, there is a lot more attention to sort of the amount of intelligence and in portrayals of enslaved people, right? So they're more humanized in portrayals these days, and they're understood, I think, in many cases, both in popular representations and in scholarship, as having been essential to the formation of the modern world in a way that's much more pervasive and more palpable than has been the case until now. But it's still the case that often when people talk about the link between slavery and capitalism, they talk about cotton in particular. So we think about some of the most important histories of slavery and capitalism that have come out recently, in particular Walter Johnson's River of Dark Dreams, Sven Becker's Empire of Cotton, and Ed Baptist, The Half That Has Never Been Told, all heralded for good reason as books that are very ambitious and deliver very successfully on their claims to show how central slavery is to what we think of as capitalism or modern capitalism. But they also focus on cotton and or use cotton as their point of departure. And in particular, two of them, Ed Baptist's book and Walter Johnson's, are about sort of 19th century Mississippi River Valley in particular, right? And I guess my intervention is probably about saying, in the same moment that they're studying the last few decades of legalized slavery, enslaved people become central to a host of industries in very important ways that are often overlooked because cotton wound up being the most lucrative industry.
You were talking about reparations at the start, and I was wondering if you see this project as a tool in case reparations.
All right, so the question was about whether I see this project as a tool in the sort of case reparations. I would say that well, part of what this project does is show just how lucrative the enslavement was and just how important enslaved people were to a range of industries. It also identifies people like by name and by location, and certainly that data can be beneficial to people pursuing reparations. And in the case of Virginia in particular, there's a woman who she's like an amateur historian, and she, just meaning that she doesn't have a PhD in history, but she's like a great historian, and she's from an area where enslaved coal miners built a church in Virginia, and she recognized in some of this data that some of her people she's related to were some of the founders of that church and early members of that church. And so, like in her case, for instance, she could approach the company that enslaved them because slave insurance has often been dismissed by people who would say, well, or its preparations for slavery, I guess, have been dismissed as an idea where people would say, like, okay, how could you ever prove that who was liable for enslaving your ancestor who made money from that? And so this archive does do that for some people. I would say it's also worth pointing out that a few years before this legislation was passed, that stipulates that financial institutions have to disclose their historical relationship to slave trade. There was legislation passed related to Holocaust insurance policies, which stipulated that, and in California it was passed that it said if you are an insurance firm and you paid a German firm or someone tied to Nazis or for the policy of a Jewish person during the Holocaust or someone who was a victim of the Holocaust, that even if you pay out before the policy, you'd have to pay out again to the family. And there was an international Holocaust insurance commission that was organized to help people identify whose the family members might have been who lost policies and to force companies to pay. And that when this legislation was passed around slave insurance policies, it stipulated that it was for pedagogical purposes and that it would not be tied to any specific reparations project. And that's interesting, right? Because it begs the question, why? It's one thing to say that it's not possible to identify people. It's another to say that people won't even entertain the idea of reparations. And I think, certainly part of the reason certain firms were probably comfortable sharing the data is because it was not tied to any sense of liability, but it certainly seems like it's available for that. Yeah, follow-up question? Yeah.
So you're saying that this is only like 15% of the policies?
Yeah, I would say, yeah.
Because I saw a statement by Aetna where they said, oh, we've only produced a dozen slave insurance policies. And you've only gotten 15% and you found 28 already.
Right.
Where does that leave the project going forward?
Yeah. Well, I would say that I'm happy to continue to enhance the database, like based on policies that can be discovered. I think that it's a sort of legitimate challenge to try to figure out where those policies might be, but for sure there could be insurance companies that are sitting on policies. There could be policies in even people's personal collections and family archives. Another historian once told me that she saw documents from her own family, and there was reference to an insurance policy that someone had on one of her family members. I think that where policies are found will be things like that, either some collection that people are hiding or just happen to not be aware of and discover, or ad hoc sort of individual policies that show up. I've sometimes found policies in a state archive that are not really organized as insurance policies, but just kind of happen to be made a reference to or something like that. So I think, yeah, I'd like the idea of the kind of projects that can be updated over time, and even be available to people who are interested in the kind of research. So I guess I should mention now that along the lines of future research, future possibilities, I am interested in right now developing another dimension to this map, which is about comparing slave prices, sale prices to insurance premiums, because until now, when people talk about how valuable a slave was, we're talking about prices, in the auction place, in the marketplace, how much a slave sold for. They're not talking about how much that slave was insured for or what the cost of the premium was. So I think I sort of want the map to put prices in conversation with premiums as different ways to think about value. So that's what I'm working on right now. And then I'm also working on essays that are related to the people in this archive or to the industries mentioned here. So either about how industry worked, I've written something brief about coal mines that in insurance and slavery coal mines that I'll put in the blog part of the site. And I also have one of the enslaved people in this data set wrote a memoir, at least one of them, and so I'll write about him a little bit. I'll talk about his life and what was at stake for him. And so like basically, you know, I do want to tease out whatever we can learn from this, um, this phenomenon, you know. So I'm exploring different ways, you know, different ways to think about what data might be here. All right, so Tammy.
I have two distinct questions. One just about the data set and comparison, and one about this as a digital humanities project. So first, I'm working with European on Copy Hudson. Recent work on banks to compare the roots of Wall Street versus New York, being so deeply entrenched in the American region. So I'm just wondering, I know a great deal of work has been done on insurance on bonded in Barbados. I'm just wondering if there was any, are you aware of any conversation or any sort of reference between the continental US and folks in the region? And then two, I'm just interested in, I think about digital humanities and sort of mapping and accessibility a lot, and I'm just wondering, because like you found a great partner in this Boston-based coding company, sort of what your thoughts are on accessibility and mapping and how you got to this sort of interface.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, so the question of insurance, yeah, it's a great question. So two questions, I guess. First question is about the geography, like what does it mean to think about slave insurance and slavery and insurance in terms of other regions of the world? The other question is about digital humanities and how to approach this and what we do methodologically and analytically. So in terms of the geography, yeah, I've thought a lot about this because obviously, you know, marine insurance, which would include sort of slaves as cargo, is like the earliest form of insurance we sort of know of. It goes back to like the 15th century. And, you know, as early as the 15th century, marine insurance included like debtors or slaves who were insured, whose lives were insured, or who are insured. They're insured as cargo, but like it's also kind of, marine insurance is also life insurance if it's a person being insured, you could argue, right? So it's like, it's interesting that what's thought of as marine insurance, which is really understood in terms of cargo or objects, could be other things that are just objectified, basically, right? But that is to say, it is a global industry, which means that you could put this in conversation with other industries elsewhere. So for sure, I'd be open and interested in like data, right, that I could put with this data. Like so, for my own purposes, I'm interested in like if I was to map like slaves as cargo, insured slaves as cargo, it would transform this because this really is about sort of enslaved workers insured in the last few decades of legalized slavery, but it could also be about, you know, shipping routes. I could have a map that extends to the Atlantic Ocean that has shipping routes and shows like which ships insured, which amount of slaves for how much, you know, that you could imagine that. And then that I would love to enhance it with data. But it also leads to the second question. So when I first was sort of trying to build this or envision this project, I consulted a colleague who had done a really amazing map, multimedia map. And let's just say the firm he worked with, it cost probably at least like 3 times, maybe more than 3 times what I ultimately paid the Boston firm. So it was just not even within my realm to sort of work with that firm. But also, no offense to that firm, but like the Boston firm had a much better proposal, in my view. Did excellent work. So I think, you know, a lot of tech firms probably have inflated invoices and things like that, right? So, and I was blessed in that I had very modest means anyway, so I couldn't entertain certain kinds of proposals. But I would say that going forward, I mean, it is always, I mean, for me, I have different kinds of creative projects, and it's always a really tricky question, like who to work with and under what conditions, and like where will the money come from, you know? Because, you know, I don't happen to have a lot of personal wealth, and also there's not a lot of incentives for us to do this kind of work. I guess this is what it's communities. Like I've had conversations with my chair of my department, and you know about this work and like the scholarly merit of it, and like she pointed out to me that no one has ever been promoted based on anything other than a book, as far as she's aware of, right? Now, whether anyone could be promoted based on something other than a book at some point is an interesting question. You know, just because that's happened doesn't mean it could not happen, but will it happen? This is the question. Right? So I think it's important if people think of a project as having a lot of scholarly merit that they foreground that, right? That they advocate for that kind of scholarship, you know? And I think many of us, we would certainly say there are all kinds of projects that are about books, like whether it's a film, whether it's a multimedia data set, whether it's even a kind of artistic installation that we think of as a very important scholarly contribution, original scholarly contribution, well researched, insightful, etc., and that it does contribute to scholarship in the field. So I think it is for us in the context of digital humanities to sort of advocate for work like that, to produce work like that, to comment on it, critique it, right? To draw it into the kind of scholarly conversation. So, but it's a great question. It's like a question that we're sort of like still grappling with. Like, what does it mean? Like, you know, many of us are doing this kind of work. We train to do this kind of work. We like to do this kind of work, but can this kind of work be institutionalized as part of like scholarly formation, and promotion?
Yeah, I had a question about the possibility of extending it to look at ships and cargo and stuff, because those are contexts where the model has a problem of, there have been a lot of cases about slaves being thrown overboard to collect insurance. So that's so yes, I was just question whether they looked into those cases, or whether there's. I'm surprised that there hasn't been on that the same incentives to, but
Okay, so just to clarify, are you asking? You're saying you're surprised that like the problem of moral hazard seems not to have been a part of this kind of industry in the way it was.
because there the insurance industry of course has a different incentives from ship captains and
Yeah.
so
Yeah, that's easier. Yeah, it's just kind of like what you kind of just might call like a principal agent problem, like or something like that. Discrepancies in like incentives and things like that.
and there are people, so people did throw people over.
Right, obviously. Yeah. So I would say that I mean, I'm interested in marine insurance, this like this cargo insurance, and I'm interested in the transformation from that industry to this industry, and to the breaking point, as I said before, like the banning slave trade in the U.S., but yet slavery is still legal, and that unleashes this possibility. And I'm interested in like what an archive could reveal about the relationship between those things, and even like valuation across this kind of divide. Like, how do we think of cargo being priced differently from a worker or something like that? But I think that insurance such as cargo tends itself to dehumanization and to this kind of problem more than insurance such as workers, because the conceit of insurance such as workers is that they have some kind of expertise that is valuable in the marketplace that should ideally be preserved and even enhanced. So, but it's still a course of context. So I think that the slave insurance says more about what we think of as free labor than it does, in some ways, about what we think of as slavery, or it's at the nexus, and even literally in the sense that like an enslaved coal miner could work alongside a free worker, and the enslaved coal miner could arguably be more valuable in terms of they could be an insurance policy on that coal miner's life, but not on the free worker's life, and yet the enslaved worker is less free in that if a mine blows up, and mines blew up, and they would like report the names of the free workers in the newspaper, but not the enslaved workers, right? So like there's a kind of financial question, but then there's the kind of legal question or something like that, the kind of like social question, and sometimes they're at cross purposes. And then I guess you sort of reminded me that one thing I would say though about how I think about slave insurance also is that I think that slave insurance is like the template for life insurance, not just because it helped build a kind of familiarity that I think free people then used, but also because I think what life insurance is for us in the post-Bellum period is like the democratization of slave insurance, in the sense that like slave insurance is a calculus sort of suggesting that people aren't equal, and that their values based on their skill set and their medical history, and the risk factors associated with their work or where they live. And life insurance draws on these various variables as well. But life insurance relies on confidential information, and so that the kind of calculus on which it relies is hidden, right? So the calculus on which it relies is not disclosed to us, and so it's kind of both maybe paradoxical, but also telling that we associate life insurance with free society. Like we call ourselves free, even though like an actuary does not think of us as free, because we have different medical histories, different potential future earning power, different risk factors associated with how we live. I have a friend who's from Haiti, and he's doing a life insurance policy, and they were like, "Are you gonna go back to visit anytime soon?" He said, "Yeah." And I'm like, "Okay." And they thought of that as a risk factor, and he thought of that as going home, So that's life insurance. And so I think that it's both telling but also disturbing that life insurance is essentially the democratization of slave insurance, and that's what we call freedom. So
So I was just wondering, sort of on that, the calculus, how different the different primary records looked. And I apologize if the humans that you made for that.
no, that's okay. Yeah, oh, go ahead.
And I would just ask the second one.
Sure, yeah. So feel free, go.
Okay, and the second one is sort of related, is just, I was just wondering if any of the policies are different for women. I think when I look at primary records and see like transferring an enslaved woman and her, all of her offspring so that you have to come, I just wonder if that plays out in all insurance.
So in terms of primary, the question was about whether primary records, how do they look from place to place. So when the state insurance departments fielded the correspondence from the insurance firms, they basically just made like what could be called, I guess, like a kind of table or something. They made tables basically. So the tables they usually were like two tables in the like California Department of Insurance like page somewhere in the website, in the Illinois Department of Insurance page. You could find these tables where it would say like slave owner and where the slave lived and different data organized either by slave person name or owner name. You could look at the table two different ways, and it was just that data. And that was about like 600 records that they had. So that's one source of kind of primary data. But then, and they also, like, I visited the California Department of Insurance, like sort of, and looked at the paperwork myself, so that data had like the correspondence from general counsel of the insurance firms, and then also their really poor photocopies of records, like just like all the data they had. And it was clearly sort of like not prepared by like an archivist or a librarian or a scholar who would be concerned with the scholarly value. It's clearly like someone running copies, and even if it's not legible, it doesn't matter because they sent it. So it's like terrible quality. So there's that. Then there's also like the Baltimore Life Insurance Company's archive, which is in Maryland, in Baltimore, Maryland. And then there was also just sort of other documents I found, and like either online or just different kinds of collections. So they look differently in the sense that, like the Baltimore Life Insurance, there was like a pamphlet, like selling insurance. There was like correspondence between different agents, making a plea about insuring someone or discussing this individual and being insured. There were applications, copies of applications in which a person is being evaluated, like what the enslaved person does and how much they'd be insured for. And so what's interesting about that is that you start to notice that, while legally slaves are property again, and historians who have written about insurance always differentiate between life insurance and slaves as property, and that's why they didn't really bother to explore it, because they just probably thought, I think they thought to themselves like, well, slaves are property, that means they weren't that valuable, that significant. There's not much to say about that, right? But I think that when you look at the applications, a lot of the applications did not say something like, they didn't say like slave insurance application, they just said insurance application. It just happened to be from a slave person. And I think there's a way, this is important, I think, methodologically, because I think what happens a lot of times is when we're aware of a sort of a course of context, we have some kind of parameters around, say, race or gender, sexuality that we're operating with, we sort of presume that that infrastructure was in place until it was no longer in place. But sometimes there are kind of ebbs and flows in which you would call kind of a coercive infrastructure, and it might be more porous in the beginning, and then more sedimented, and then more porous again, rather than coercive until it's free or something like that. So like there are a lot of people coming to the U.S. that had a lot of rights until the rights were taken away, and then they had a lot of rights again. So I think that's very telling, right? So when some enslaved people were insured, I don't even think the first thought was, oh, these are people that own property. They're probably like, oh man, I have a blacksmith. He can do amazing things, and I want to rent him out, but I want to make sure I can get some money back for him. That's sort of like they would think of anything that's valuable, right? So in the marketplace, I guess I'm saying like the notions were more porous to some extent than they are in the sort of juridical realm. Like these same enslaved people who could command a high premium and a highly valued policy would not legally be allowed to testify in court, right? So it's not like they're free, but in the marketplace they're valuable. So I think there's that. But then your other question about like how gender or sexuality or other factors like age maybe influence the policy or like how they play out. So I have two of the entries are about nurses, and I don't quite know what that means. You know, like I don't know what is it a wet nurse? You know, is it an obstetrician? You know, because there are enslaved women who were essentially like more proficient than medical doctors at delivering babies. And even as we discussed at a workshop I was recently at with Helena Hansen, you know, we discussed that even the field of obstetrics obviously has been shaped by slavery in various ways. J. Marion Sims experimented on enslaved women, and also obviously benefited tremendously from the expertise of enslaved women. So were they doctors essentially, or were they wet nurses? Or, I don't know what nurse means, and there are only two entries, so I don't know what to make of that. But it's a good question. And then also, you know, you notice there are policies on people as young as like 12 years old who are like minors or something like that, right? So like maybe they're minors, maybe they're like minors apprentices or something like that. So you can be very young and still be very seen as very valuable, have a kind of premium skill set. And certainly those skills, the kind of like artisanal or industrial skills I'm talking about, were also often transmitted along family lines, right? Because it's like you would teach your children your skills, even if part of which you hope is just to spare them the worst possible fate under enslavement. So to the extent possible, we want them to get skills to be seen as more highly skilled and more mobile than the alternative, right? Um, so those are some of the ways I think that those characters play out. But I think if you look at the various industries, the question of say gender, sexuality, and geography is essential. You know, in the sense that well, most obviously the overwhelming majority are men. You know, who are insured, and when women are insured, usually it's sort of as a nurse or as a kind of household manager. And then there are exceptions. It could be a woman doing other kinds of tasks, but it's often very kind of like industrial skills, clerical skills, or sort of household kind of managerial skills. I feel like here.
So I was sitting here wondering about what happened to all the insurance companies' files on these this insured property. And one of the thoughts I had, so this is my question, well, it's another two-part question, is what happened when, you know, in 1865 with the insurance policies? Did owners try to collect, or did the enslaved people try to collect on them, or were they just kind of went up in smoke? Does anybody know?
I think that well, I don't see any evidence of enslaved people trying to collect on the value of policies, and I wonder to what extent they were aware of policies. Excuse me, on their lives. And I think for insurance companies, it just depended. Like many of them sort of died out in the late 1850s, early 1860s. You know, with sort of end of slavery on the horizon. So I don't know how many of them, you know, experienced it as a kind of instantaneous transformation, something like that. But it's a good question. You know, I mean, I tend to think that like a lot of the companies, when they kind of folded and either acquired in a systematic way or just kind of fell apart, then the no one thought of it as worth preserving as an archive per se, but maybe it still exists in some form in family records or some other kind of capacity, you know. But I'm not sure exactly. But I did want to mention something in terms of I mean the one person who wrote a narrative that's in the database, he did strategically use insurance to sort of like reconstitute his own family and things like that in different moments. So like, well, you know, there was a time when he like knew one of his children was in bondage and persuaded like friends of his through church networks to like buy the children out of slavery, or like to free them and help him buy them out of slavery, and like help them take out a policy on his children for the time being that he sort of treated as like a security until he could raise the money to pay them back. So that's interesting because he used a lot of insurance to kind of help reconstitute his family. So there was that. But yeah, I think that for most enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, they were not able to benefit from monetary value placed on their lives, right? Yeah. That's good. Tammy?
I have a question just about how you frame this project. This is on the face of a very quantitative project, and I'm thinking about the importance of not being first, right? So it's these sort of narratives that you're gesturing towards, right? So what does it mean to be a nurse? Actually know more about the lives of the dots, understand? And I'm thinking about this in particular because you talked about younger enslaved people being insured. So for instance, 12 years old, and Jennifer Morgan's going to work on this legal language and legislative shift, right? Talking about the children produced by slave masters and enslaved women not as children or offspring, but issues. It's like a legal category so that they're not human beings. So I'm just wondering, like, as you think forward and we have the ethnographic, the narrative, the quantitative, the qualitative, we know more about these insured persons.
Right.
Is it possible that we then see, oh, it's actually the slave master insuring his children in some of these instances?
Oh yeah, well, there's two questions I feel like. So one question is about ethnography or qualitative research as it relates to quantitative, and what can we kind of learn about the lives of enslaved people, and
in both registers.
yeah, different registers. And then I think then the other question is about the kind of proximity that enslaved people might have to the people enslaving them, or like the familial connections and things like that. I think. Particularly in the case of even more so than slave insurance policies, to take the latter question first, in slave mortgages, you see really tight familial bonds because like slave mortgages, which haven't been written about much, this is like one academic article and one dissertation on slave mortgages, but that happened, especially in places where like land was abundant, but people didn't have a lot of capital or a lot of money per se, but they did have slaves and they were moving to new places, like let's say rural Alabama or rural Virginia or something like that, and wanted to kind of essentially use their slaves as collateral to get land. In some cases, you have, like, say, a wealthy man from New York who had purchased a woman who was enslaved, and then later had children with this woman, and realized that these children are viewed as enslaved property in the eyes of the bank. He can take out a mortgage on these children to get land, and that would mean that if he cannot pay, if he missed payments on the land, the bank would seize the children. But if he did make payments to the bank, he could keep his children, and even though the children are commodified, he can still experience them as his children in terms of family life. So, like, to answer your question, yes, there's a way in which the kind of financial architecture is bound up in these structures of intimacy. The other part of your question, though, about like qualitative research versus quantitative. So, like, yeah, one of the things I tried very hard to do is to try to go through the records and try to find out everything I can about the enslaved people or the owners. And for most enslaved people, I can't find out anything more than like their name or something like that. At times, you can find there's in the records like some anecdotal information about them at times. Like, let's say something about where they worked or how they worked or like the kind of things they did or able to do. Like maybe it shows up in just like the kind of peripheral information in an application or just some random comment. But then, except for like the case where the guy who wrote a memoir and stuff, it's kind of hard to find out about the enslaved people. And even it's sometimes hard to find out about the owners because many of the owners, to the extent that they were renting out enslaved people and they just had a few they were renting out or something like that. They're not like plantation slave owners who have like hundreds and hundreds of slaves, and so they're not that significant socially oftentimes. So it is kind of hard to find out about them actually, or to find out more than like basic information like how old they were, or where they lived, or what the value of their property was. So it's like a kind of it's an uphill battle, but I'm definitely interested in this question. Like, one of the questions for me throughout the life of this project has been like, what kind of narrative can I ultimately produce about this? Like, what kind of stories can I tell? What kind of story will I tell you? So I'm actively engaged in that. But I do want to say something about, you raised a different kind of issue actually, though, in talking about enslaved children not being children but being issues. I wonder about that formulation. Like, I think the way I see it is that they exist in different registers, right? And so, like, I think that the person, like, we think of these examples like mortgages. It's probably, people don't tend to think of their most intimate and most meaningful relationships as commodified, but they often are, right? And so I think that no matter who you are, whether you're a free person or an enslaved person, it's obviously a different structure if you're enslaved, but I think, I don't think that the fact that they're commodified means that people did not have meaningful relationships. I think that, that's not an ideal example with the sort of white man who buys a woman from slavery and has children with her. But in other contexts, I would say, like, I think that the marketplace of slave insurance is grappling with the ingenuity of enslaved people or the ingenuity of African people, right? I think it's not merely the case that they're seen as machines or something like that. I think that some of them are making products that are very impressive from an aesthetic standpoint, and they're acquiring skills at a rate that is impressive. When people talk about hemp in Kentucky, they say like, okay, so we tried various things for sort of extracting fiber from hemp, but nothing, none of the machines, none of the sort of animal power has worked as well as like a stout Negro man with the handbrake. Like, there's a way they're kind of marveling at this ingenuity and at this expertise. They are also sort of dismissing it and like wanting to diminish it, but yet they're grappling with the fact that, like, well, if these people are so far beneath us, how come they can do things that we can't? You know what I mean? Or like, and I think that they're sort of grappling with that. So I think it's actually important that, and this is why I think that, like, it makes sense that this sort of the birth of enslaved church corresponds to the demise of legalized slavery. That slavery is becoming increasingly untenable, and and as that's happening, people are grappling with the skills that African Americans are able to acquire and what they're able to accomplish. And people certainly want to profit and benefit from their skills, but also people are grappling with the magnitude of their skills and their expertise. And then if you think of like a household management situation as well, like, this is kind of fascinating that someone would insure like a butler or a barber or a domestic worker. Like, what does that mean? Because, like, they're not just working that person to death and then feeling like the person can be replaced easily. They're essentially saying the person cannot be replaced easily. So why? Like, what does that person knows about the family? What is that person's role in the family that the person is so valuable? Right? So.
There's a question from someone on our live stream. She asks, is there a comprehensive list of financial institutions like banks and insurance companies that have benefited from or financed slavery?
The question from the live stream was like, is there a comprehensive list of banks and financial institutions that have benefited from or financed slavery? Not that I'm aware of, but I'm up for that. I think we could do that. So I think that could be something we do on the Reparations Project like website. We can like explore that and then post that. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. No, go ahead.
I'm really interested in these insurance policies as, instruments in a larger legal context or ecosystem in which I imagine that slave owners had kind of different instruments available to them to manage uncertainties. Insurance policies are a contract which helps you manage a certain form of uncertainty. And I wonder if their relevance in the hiring out situation, renting out a slave situation that you talked about, it seems like it wouldn't result just from the risky work that slaves might be doing, because you could keep your slave at home, with you and have them doing risky work, and you still be worried about losing them as blacksmiths or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if part of the reason they were used particularly in the hiring out situation was because slave owners maybe didn't have a lot of instruments to be able to bring their contractual partners to court if something went wrong. So if I rent my slave out to you and he has an accident, something bad happens to him, can I not take you to court? Or is that why these insurance policies are attractive?
Yeah, that's a great. So the question was about whether part of what made insurance policies attractive is that there was kind of people were wary of the legal infrastructure. Yeah, actually, I have a chapter that I wrote for a book that Sven Becker and Chris DeSantis just edited called America's Capitalisms. It just came out last week, but that I start off by talking about a court case in Virginia about a coal miner, and it's like coal miner was rented to someone else, and I was saying that exact point that the fact that this guy sued this other guy sort of proved that, well, it was kind of rare because actually usually people would take out insurance for this reason, and I was sort of like posing this question like why did this lawsuit unfold this way, and then to Tammy's question, the loss even in the judge's opinions about the case, you know, they also agreed that this man was owed this money. They were talking about like, you know, how valuable, and it was interesting that in the narrative, both from the witnesses and also the judges kind of conceded that this enslaved person who died was regarded as the foreman of the mine and thus the most expert worker at the mine. And it's not clear that only enslaved people worked at the mine, but it is clear that the foreman of the mine was an enslaved person. And so, but then there was one judge that thought like, well, why would you ever make a Negro the foreman of mine anyway? This is ridiculous. So, but this was just one of the judges who thought that compared to all of them. So the rest of them accepted this idea of the expertise of the foreman. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there's definitely something here about the legal infrastructure. And even the kind of, if you think about it like 1808 onward or something, it's like the U.S. is opening up. They're systematically, so colonists are systematically acquiring territory that is subjugating indigenous people and stealing territory. And therefore, it's spreading out and becoming so vast and so uncertain. Maybe there's questions about the legal recourse, you know, and even people are sometimes renting slaves out to other states, and there could be this kind of logistical challenge of trying to, you know, be able to take someone to court or something like that. But yeah, there's something I think important about the relationship between insurance and legal infrastructure. And I guess I'm glad you asked that because I think a lot about how insurance has a relationship to infrastructure. Like people often use insurance in the place of sort of adequate infrastructure of different kinds. So like, you know, people who would say, oh, okay, after the Hurricane Katrina, people should just have more flood insurance, even though there's not that much flood insurance available in this federal program. They're not saying, okay, we need better levees and better streets and better transportation systems for getting people out of danger. You know, they're just saying, oh, get insurance, flood insurance, or like, you know, people who are opposed to Affordable Care Act are saying like, well, young people can just take out disaster insurance in case they get leukemia or something, but most young people are healthy. They don't need health care, you know? Right, so there's that kind of way this financial instrument is put forth as a solution to what otherwise might be an infrastructure problem. So I think that's a very important point, actually.
So it sounds in a sense like that slaves are also at the vanguard of an American movement towards the individualization or privatization of all kinds of services that might otherwise be provided more strongly in the public realm.
Yeah, I think that's well put. So also, I think related to that, you know, part of the reason that life insurance becomes significant is that people are moving to urban areas and they're no longer in the kind of agrarian communities like about the 1820s, 30s, 40s. As the U.S. becomes more urban, an individual might leave a family, usually a father, and go to the city for work, and they are not relying as much on agrarian communities or family networks and mutual aid societies, etc. So yeah, I think for sure that like slave insurance or the practice of insuring slaves also is part of that process, or even maybe like I say, you know, paves the way for that practice. And that's certainly tied with that practice.
Yeah, I just have another question about insurance claims that may be hidden in some ways. That because presumably plantation owners, for instance, must be insuring the plantation as a whole, and I would imagine that the costing of the plantation insurance as a whole would you can trace that to see how different plantations, depending on how many slaves they had, were costed differently and so on. So that there must be some. So that will be life insurance, but it must be the lives of slaves that would have been part of the insurance, the way you would, I suppose, insure a tractor. So there must be all these hidden ways in which lives were assessed financially.
Yes and no. Though I think, you know, what's interesting is like in 19th century Jamaica, like Vince Brown writes about the fact that in 19th century Jamaica, the mortality rates were so high amongst planters themselves that they would insure their cargo, but they couldn't even get policies on their own lives. So, you know, so I think that like when like property insurance or like fire insurance or life insurance comes into the picture is actually interesting. And at that, like now we might say, okay, so people all have homeowners and renters insurance and also life insurance and also car insurance. We think of insurance in a much more comprehensive way. I think in that moment, it was much more piecemeal. Like a person may or may not have insurance. A person may or may not have this kind of insurance or that kind. Like so, it's not even obvious to me that all plantations would have been insured, for instance, right? I think some people would insure them, and some people would say, like, hey, well, I'm just gonna go for it and just hope it doesn't burn down. I just think it was much more ad hoc and piecemeal and things like that. But even then, even if it did, but I think it's a good question because it does. It does. Like I think we could benefit from thinking of it that way, like sort of asking ourselves which different kinds of insurance might be bundled together in a given context or not. So maybe there are 3 or 4 different kinds of insurance happening in this one site, and then none at all happening in this other site. And that's actually an interesting way to think about it. And certainly, like when I was first thinking about slave insurance, life insurance, and I was thinking about like when these different forms of insurance come into being, like when does marine insurance kind of come into being, and when does fire insurance, property insurance come into being. And it's interesting in this regard that like one of the firms that did insure enslaved people was a Richmond Fire Insurance Company, which seems weird because it's not a life insurance company. But then you say, oh, actually, slaves were technically property. So what they're saying is like we specialize in property that can be damaged or stuff like that. Right? So it's like even though they came to, you think it was life insurance, they came to it through property insurance, whereas someone else might come to it through life insurance. Cool question.
I may have missed this because I came in late, but is this a website?
Oh yeah, it's a website. The URL is just www.treasuryofwearysouls.com. And then the website for the Reparations Project is www.thereparationsproject.org. .com. .com. And then and so like I think through the Reparations Project, since that's the theme of this semester, you can just comment on the workshop and leave comments, etc. I guess I need to create a tab on the Treasury of Weary Souls website where people can share information or something like that, share contact info. But thank you for a really great questions, and I appreciate being able to share with you.